Steve, my name is Grace O'Keefe. This lecture was originally given in person on Friday, the 13th of May 2022 in All Saints Church in Raheny as part of a set of historical talks called Raheny Through the Ages. These talks are part of the 2022 Old Raheny Church and Graveyard project. Dublin City Council's North Central Area Office, with support from Parks, Archaeology, Conservation and Heritage departments, organised a project in Raheny called the Old Raheny Church and Graveyard Project, which was in association with the Raheny Heritage Society, All Saints Church, Our Lady of Mother of Divine Grace Church, Raheny Tidy Village Group and Raheny Business Association. On Friday the 13th, the talks included my own talk, followed by Dr. Ruth McManus of DCU. She's a geographer and cartographer. Following Ruth, there were three members of the Raheny Heritage Society, Douglas Appleyard, Joan Sharkey, and Noel Carlin, who all talked about both the work of the Raheny Heritage Society over the years and also some of their own research that they're working on at the moment. So my own talk focuses on the earlier history of Raheny, the earlier history of North County Dublin, and I suppose its association with the medieval city of Dublin itself. For most people of my generation and older, the history that we were taught at school tended to focus on national or international events. So for instance, the big names, the big dates that signify the beginning and ends of wars in particular. In the first year of my own undergraduate degree in Trinity, we studied only medieval history, which I personally had never done before, and I loved it. Loved hearing about the Anglo-Saxons, the Carolingian Empire, and the English invasion of Ireland in 1169, which, although I had quite a nationalist education, we'd never really learned in school. So these are all wonderful and exciting events. Again, they're all quite national and international. Now, despite specializing medieval history for the remainder of my degree, it took me some time to kind of start appreciating actually the medieval world around me in the city that I lived in, which is Dublin. When I went on to do a PhD on medieval Dublin, I spent a lot of time in conference papers talking about the individuals in the city, those who had walked the streets, which are still named after their medieval function. So like Cook Street, Wine Tavern Street, Fishamble Street. Now, none of this has anything to do with Raheny, is what you're saying to yourself. What it does have to do with is the welcome shift in focus in historical studies from the national and international to the local. Now, perhaps shift is the wrong word. Perhaps it's more a broadening of the focus to include the local as a legitimate and necessary part of researching and analysing our past. And that's what does bring us to Raheny, and in particular the work of the Raheny Heritage Society, who for over 30 years have been researching and giving a voice to those who do research on the Raheny area. Now, the approach that I've taken with my talk is to hopefully collate some of the work done by the Society, the primary source references that Douglas Appleyard kindly passed on to me, with my own research into medieval Dublin. I spent a lot of time drafting this paper, trying to think of the balance between work that the Society have already published themselves and that its members would be familiar with, and trying to give them a new perspective, but also to be inclusive to anyone coming to this talk who would be unfamiliar with Raheny, maybe unfamiliar with medieval Dublin, and maybe just unfamiliar with medieval history itself. Now, any cursory search for the history of Raheny and its neighbours, Cleicester, Artane, Clontarf, will give you the very kind of basic foundation history of the area. But the bulk of what I want to present to you today is the wider world of those who either lived in the area or who had influence over those who did. I want to give you an insight into how we find out about medieval people, the sources and the methodologies that we use. My first task is to kind of set the scene a little bit for you. The map that is open on your screen now is a very small extract from a map done by John Rock. It's a very famous map of Dublin and an absolutely beautiful work of art in its own way. It's a survey of the city, harbour, bay and environs of Dublin. And it's well worth a look if you're interested in cartography at all. The very earliest names that appear to be associated with the area refer, like many place names in Dublin, or sorry, in Ireland, to geography and religion. Raheny or Ratheny, meaning the Rath of Raheny. Now, there is a substantial Rath in Raheny, perhaps with a diameter of about 110 meters, based on partial excavation of the Rath itself. Now, the religious association then comes from Saint Asam, who is being speculated as being a possible associate of Saint Patrick. Now, little sidestep for a second. If Asam is a saint, how come we don't know more about him? Many years ago, I did a master's on canonization, which focused on the 12th and 13th century and the increasingly judicial process that the papacy were imposing on the making of saints. In the early church, canonization did not require recourse to any religious authority higher than the local bishop. For instance, by being put to death, an individual could acquire martyrdom. And in the early church, the status of martyrdom was applied in the subsequent adoration of the individual. If you weren't martyred, if you were able to, for instance, provide a miracle. So one of the most common ways, I suppose, in the early medieval period would be if a person of the church, so either male or female, had died and their relics were being stored, their body was being stored, and somebody who touched the relics or were close by it were cured of some particular disease or illness. This would begin the sort of informal process of that person being seen as being sanctified. Over the course of time, a particular event came to be synonymous with the veneration of the martyr or the beginnings of a cult. And that's what's called the act of translation, elevatio corporis. So this is when the buried body was moved and relocated at a physically higher point, which then became the destination for pilgrimages. Now, in a slightly cynical bent, of course, as well, it suited a lot of churches to have a pilgrimage associated with their church because pilgrims brought money. So having a saint associated with the local church could be quite economically beneficial as well. But what essentially I'm referring to is the fact that in the earlier church, so before really we get kind of into the 13th century, becoming a saint was a much more informal process than it would become once we get into kind of the high medieval period. Now, so we know that there was very early settlement here, and certainly that it was impacted by the arrival of the Vikings. Now, I don't want to overstate their impact outside of the town of Dublin itself, but it is worth remembering that although for a long time the Vikings had nothing but negative press in Ireland, most of which in fairness was justified, we are now able to take a much broader view of their interactions with the Irish, especially when it comes to hinterland settlement. One theory about non-urban Viking settlements is that they were satellite settlements set up in various locations, and one of those locations was Finglas. Some of the information that I'm going to quote here on these satellite settlements comes from Murphy and Potterton, the Dublin region in the Middle Ages. One of those settlements then was Finglas, and what I have here on your screen is a 9th century Scandinavian brooch, which was found in Finglas as part of a burial. It was found in around 2004. It has gilding on it. It has silver inlay. The brooch was part of the burial jewelry of a woman in her 30s, whose genome has been determined to be of Viking, probably Norwegian origin, which would very much tie in with the fact that the majority of the Vikings who came to Ireland were from Norway. The image that I have on the bottom here that shows the two the two views of it is taken with courtesy from Neil Jackman of Abarta Heritage. Now, with an estimated population of about 4,500 in the mid-11th century, the town of Dublin had expanded far beyond self-sufficiency. Pigs were commonly kept within the town. Larger animals like cattle, less so, for practical reasons of space and butchering capacity. Siobhan Geraghty, a leading archaeobotanist, has identified a large number of organic material in Dublin which originated from outside the town, but within Ireland. She also suggested that an area of at least 10,000 acres would have been needed to supply Dublin with wheat around the year 1100. So we leave the Viking period with the tentative conclusion that this region was very much part of a mixed Irish and Viking area outside of Dublin, but very much part of its hinterland. Now, I'm not, as you might expect, going to delve into the Battle of Clontarf, for the simple reason that to give it justice, I would need to devote all of my time today to that one event. And there are loads and loads of reliable and accessible explanations of the battle. The slide that I have here is an extract taken from Sean Duffy's Brian Brew and the Battle of Clontarf, Dublin 2013. There's also on the Trinity College Dublin website, there is also a whole section done about the Battle of Clontarf in 2014 and about the background to it and who was involved and kind of the political alliances and marriages and all of that. So that's a really good site for you to take a look at. Now, the next monumental change that would affect our North Dublin area is, of course, the late 12th century English invasion. Now, a very, very brief summary of it for anyone watching who's not familiar with it. In the 1160s, the king of, I suppose, the man who claimed to be the overlord of Leinster, but certainly was the king of sort of County Wexford, Carlow, was a man called Diarmaid MacMurchada. He claimed to be over-king of Leinster itself, but he was having difficulties within his family, with the neighbouring kings, and he decided to go to England to ask King Henry II if Henry would come to Ireland to help him out. Now, essentially, Henry was not interested, but he allowed Diarmaid to recruit an army of mercenaries from amongst Henry's own men. The first group arrive to Ireland in 1167, but it's really the next group who arrive in 1169, May 1169, that really change completely the political landscape in Ireland. The number that came were quite small, but their military capability and how they fought was very different to the Irish, and ultimately meant that they were able to overcome the Irish. They captured Dublin in September 1170. What this leads to then is a process of sub-infeudation, which began in Leinster under one of the main leaders of the English invasion of Ireland, a man called Strongbow, Richard Fitzgilbert de Clare, but he's generally referred to by his nickname Strongbow, and also Hugh de Lacy. Now, the ancient kind of kingdoms within the provinces in Ireland were then divided up amongst these new knights who established their own areas, leasing these out to subtenants. and kind of repopulating these areas themselves with their own men and women from their lands in England. Now, many of the grants made to these knightly tenants and to their subtenants were provisional. The idea was that with Henry II's approval, they're allowed to go out and to conquer these lands, but they must pay for this conquering themselves, and they must provide the military might to protect their new areas. It's in these kind of early heady days of land grabs that we begin to see Raheny being mentioned as in the ownership of various individuals. Before I move on to that, what I have on the screen here is one of the sources that we have for the English invasion of Ireland. And I'm just going to hold up. It's taken from this book here, these extracts. So Gerald of Wales, or Geraldus Cambrensis, produced 2 works in the 1180s on the English invasion of Ireland. This one is probably the more accessible and more interesting, and it's essentially, I suppose, like a travel blog of medieval Ireland. Gerald was related to quite a few of the higher level of those first English knights who came to Ireland. So he's not the most reliable. He's certainly not unbiased, and he had his own reasons for wanting to justify why Ireland should be conquered. But this particular little book is very entertaining, not to be read with a thin skin if you're an Irish person, because he doesn't have very much good to say about us, apart from that we're good musicians. So the extract, this is just one page, just to give you a little idea of what people in England were hearing about the Irish when Gerald's work was published, because the idea, was that this would be read aloud to people, and this was part of how information was disseminated. So he says, if we go with 100 here, how they always carry an axe as if it were a staff in their hand. From an old and evil custom, they always carry an axe in their hand as if it were a staff. In this way, if they have a feeling for any evil, they can the more quickly give it effect. Wherever they go, they drag this along with them. When they see an opportunity and the occasion presents itself, this weapon has not to be unsheathed as a sword or bent as a bow or poised as a spear. Without further preparation beyond being raised a little, it inflicts a mortal blow. At hand, or rather in the hand and ever ready, is that which is enough to cause death. From the axe, there is always anxiety. If you think that you are free from anxiety, you are not free from an axe. So there's just a little sample of what Gerald had to say. Now, if you are going to claim an area, one of the things that you need to know is the boundaries of that area. The most kind of ostentatious boundary action is what was called the riding of the franchises. In 1192, John, who was not yet King of England, but he was Lord of Ireland, as appointed by his father, Henry II, he granted the citizens of Dublin the right to have their boundaries as perambulated on oath by the good men of the city. And this quote I quote here again is from Murphy and Potterton, the Dublin region in the Middle Ages. And they say some 15.5 square kilometers, 6 square miles. Sorry, this is the boundaries, excuse me, and included important areas of common pasture, as well as the coastal fringe as far as Raheny in the north and Blackrock in the south. So we see on the map here, and this map is taken from this brilliant book on the right, produced by Dublinia. And the map shows you Blackrock in the south up to Raheny in the north, and where the boundary was laid out. Now, one description of this riding of the franchises, which is from the early 17th century, makes it clear that it was a real occasion. It was a spectacle. A group of city notables would stop for lunch along the way. They would descend from their horses at various points to check a boundary stone. And at the final stop, at a point north of the mill in Raheny, they would, and I quote from Lennox Barrow, writing the franchises, they would reach a little brook, which is the end of the liberties of the city of Dublin. Now, Lennox points out in a short article about the writing of the franchises, and he says, this final point sounds like the stream at the bottom of Watermill Lane, which would mean that the mill of Raheny was on the Nankin stream, which now enters the sea through the ornamental pond in St. Anne's Park. Now, while we are talking and mentioning mills and we have maps out, I'm briefly going to talk about Raheny's mills. Now, on the Down survey map on the left here, the Down survey was taken in 1656-8. A windmill can be easily seen in Clontarf down at the bottom, and this area is known as the Sheds. Further north in Raheny, on Rock's map, so this is Rock's map over to the side, it's drawn a century after the Down survey map. We can see 3 mills marked. This is Raheny Windmill, Old Windmill, and Raheny Mill, now in ruins. Now, Raheny Windmill was on the grounds of the Capuchin Friary on Station Road. On the website excavations.ie, you can find some material that relates to small excavations that were done in this area, including attempts to find the base of these mills. The old windmill is by St. Anne's Park, and the mill in ruins down kind of over on the right is most likely the watermill of what's now called Watermill Lane. Now, again, I quote from Murphy and Potterton. Research has demonstrated that in the early medieval period, Ireland showed a remarkable precocity with regard to the development of water-powered grain mills. As Dublin's population expanded with the arrival of the English in the late 12th century, there was a corresponding increase in milling activity. And the image that I have here, excuse me, so you can see Margaret Murphy and Michael Potterton's book on the right hand side there, and it's an absolutely fantastic resource for anyone looking into, you know, a whole area of history and archaeology and sociology in the Dublin region in the Middle Ages, published by Four Courts Press. But on the left here then, you can see the timber structure, the base or the ground into which the timber structure of a windmill would have been positioned. Excuse me. Now, from the civil survey, which was taken in 1654-6, we glean a little more information about the ownership of the mills, or at least the land on which they were situated. So in Raheny, the Lord Baron of Howth held 340 acres of land, which included 2 good thatched cottages, several small cottages, 1 watermill, 1 windmill, and the walls of a decayed church. In Lusk, there was a windmill worth £5. In Swords, Christopher Fagan, an Irish papist, also owned a windmill worth £5. Now, although windmills were less common in Ireland than watermills, there's certainly a clear pattern of them in the North Dublin, South Meath area. Now, so far then we've established that as a settlement, Raheny had been probably a pre-Christian settlement, until we've more concrete evidence for the association of St. Asim with the area. There's really only kind of speculation as to who he is. We certainly know that the presence of Vikings locally is something that we can demonstrate, but is with the administrative changes brought about by the English invasion that we begin to get a little bit more information about individuals. Now, we're going to leave the suburbs for a little while and head into the medieval town. Now, my own PhD thesis was about a hospital, really a place of refuge and care on what we would now call Thomas Street. The Hospital of St. John the Baptist was founded in the 1180s It was closed in the mid-16th century as part of the dissolution of the monasteries by Henry VIII. It was a very typical institution of its time. It was situated, outside the Newgate. And if you look on this map here, now this map is a very famous map of, I suppose, late medieval, early modern Dublin. It was done by an English cartographer called John Speed. And although it's not entirely accurate, we know that there was more in the city than what we see on the map. It gives us probably one of the best views of the city emerging out of that medieval structure. So we see the walls are still in place around the city itself. If you look to the right of the map, all the way over to the right, you see number 12. That is Trinity College. So Trinity was founded in 1592. So this is about 20 years after Trinity was founded, but you can see that it's still outside the city. So it was, the whole Dame Street College Green area is still an undeveloped area. My hospital, or the hospital I'm talking about, the Hospital St. John the Baptist, is up to the left of the map. It's number 54. So it's on, like I said, Thomas Street, and it's outside the Newgate, the western gate of the medieval city, which was a very handy place for people to see the hospital on one of the kind of more important routes into the city. And the extramural location was very advantageous for those in the hospital because it gave them access to clean air. It meant the hospital had space for a garden to grow herbs and all that kind of thing. Now, one of the major components of my thesis became a prosopographical examination of the people associated with the hospital. So the benefactors and their extended social circle. Very briefly then, what is prosopography? So prosopography is the investigation of the common background characteristics of a group of actors in history by means of a collective study of their lives. The method employed is to establish a universe to be studied and then to ask a set of uniform questions about birth and death, marriage and family, social origins, inherited economic position, place of residence, education, amount and source of wealth, occupation. And that definition is taken from an article written by Lawrence Stone called Prosopography. And essentially, this particular methodology is particularly useful where you are trying to get information about people who haven't left a huge amount of information about themselves. So people that are kind of below the wealthy, below the, say for the medieval period, below the kind of knightly class. So those for whom there may only be a few references. So you're trying to collate all of these together to get a picture of the time period in which they'd lived, who they were associated with. Now, reading through some of the medieval primary sources that covered this area of Dublin, meaning North County Dublin, so Raheny, Rath, etc., I began to see names that were familiar to me through my work on the hospital. Families I was familiar with because of their participation in the municipal life of Dublin. So they were property holders or even office holders. Now, how do we find out about these people? So if you're interested in doing kind of research on people in medieval Dublin, how do we find out about them? This is just another view. It's kind of a model made of the Speed's map, again, which I think is just brilliant. It really kind of brings to life the houses and the churches. So you see number 3 kind of on the right over there is Dublin Castle. You see in the center, number 7 is Christchurch Cathedral. So sources. So for a city whose records have been repeatedly neglected, destroyed and lost, Dublin has retained many sources through which it is possible to identify the citizens of the town and the hinterland. Virtually any administrative, legal or ecclesiastical source provides evidence for those who lived, worked and prayed in and outside of the city's boundaries. Editors, both modern and antiquarian, have used these cartularies, these registers, wills, and other assorted documents to compile, inter alia, lists of mayors, provosts, bailiffs, members of the guild, merchant, and free citizens. Now, despite providing valuable evidence of those who inhabited and managed Dublin, the use of names is not without difficulties. So, for instance, there is a lack of consistency in medieval naming practices, and this meant that it's not uncommon for individuals perhaps to have more than one surname, or certainly to have very different spellings of the same surname. People were known by occupation, were known by toponyms, patronymics, matronymics, and nicknames. So these are all the different methods that people use as identifiers. Now, the Dublin Guild Merchant Roll, which is an image that I have on the screen here, was compiled in the late 12th up to the I suppose the late 13th century. The roll contains names of those admitted to the Merchant Guild of Dublin, with, for the early years, the fine or the money that was paid on entry into the guild merchant, the Merchant Guild, sorry. This resource is now digitized and is available online courtesy of Dublin City Archives. It is an amazing resource. The way in which it's being provided online means that you can search through it under various different categories. So if this is a time period that you're researching in any way, or you just have a casual interest in it, do go and have a look at the Guild Merchant Roll online. Now, one of the more prestigious names who has been traditionally associated with Raheny is John de Courcy. Now, he's named as Lord of Ratheny and Kilbarrack. In some places, this is named as kind of the John de Courcy, who died in 1219, who was a huge figure in the early years of the English invasion of Ireland. He's the man who took over the Lordship of Ulster. He became a promoter of the primacy of Armagh over Dublin in ecclesiastical circles. Realistically, it's unlikely to have been him. It's more likely to have been what was called then his illegitimate son, who was also named John de Courcy. But parts of Raheny certainly had very significant landlords. So for instance, Christchurch Cathedral held lands there. St. Mary's Abbey held lands there. There's another brilliant resource online called The Lands of St. Mary's Abbey, which is published by the Royal Irish Academy, part of the proceedings of the Royal Irish Academy, but that is available online, and it shows again kind of the extent of the land holdings by these medieval churches. This book also, Christchurch Deeds, is a great resource for kind of tracing people or tracing areas and the different connections that Christchurch Cathedral would have had, whether they held the lands there or if they were owed rental payments from it. Now, I'm going to widen the geographic scope a little bit to include neighbouring areas like Artane, Colester and Swords. Now, around 1177, Archbishop Lawrence O'Toole granted a William Brune, that'd be B-R-U-N, but again, spelt in various different ways. So this William Brune was granted the land of Colester for the rent of ½ ounce of gold on the altar of the church, booths to the prior, and all the tithes of that land. John Cummin, the first English appointed prelate, that was in 1181, and Lawrence O'Toole's successor, confirmed the grant in 1181. Now, William Brune and his family are fairly well documented in sources for medieval Dublin. A William Brune appears in the Guild Merchant Roll, and who was part of various witness lists throughout the city, which would show his association with the other kind of prestigious families within the city. Now, I'm very going to briefly actually talk more about his death, than his life because of kind of the drama of what happened. In 1199, a number of prominent, well-known citizens became involved in what was apparently the first recorded appeal from Ireland to John since his accession to the English throne. A dispute had apparently arisen between William Broome and a Warren de London, which prompted William to request the then justiciar to force Warren and his associates to keep the peace. On leaving Dublin Castle, having been called there by the justiciar, William, unfortunately, was struck by a hatchet. He fell into the castle ditch and he died 3 days later. Now, Broome's associates claimed that the guilty parties comprised of this Warren de London and several other individuals, and that on raising a hue and cry, Warren had allowed the murderer onto his property where he gave him refuge. Now, Warren claimed that he'd broken leg, and an inquisition was ordered to establish if his associates, had pledged to keep the peace. The accused were ordered to defend themselves by various ordeals, and a day was set for them to defend themselves before the king. Unfortunately, we have no further record of what happened in this case, but Auden Broome, so son of the poor unfortunate William, was a clerk to Archbishop John Cummin, and Auden had clearly demanded justice. He compelled one of the men involved in this, a man called Richard Gillemichael, to give 66 marks, 2 shillings and 3 pence towards license for appeal. Now, although medieval Dublin was quite physically small, and those who traded with each other and appeared together in its administrative records were only one section of the population, it's still surprising to find Auden and the accused, William of Warren, a few years later witnessing charters together. So it would suggest that perhaps some kind of retribution or settlement of some kind had been found between the two parties. William Broome and his wife Susanna had 4 children. So Auden, I've mentioned, they had Susanna, Hilary and Alicia. The Broome name appears throughout the 13th and 14th centuries by holders of various different important offices. It's impossible to say, it's just at this stage, excuse me, if they're all part of the same family or not. There was a 13th century clerk and Baron of the Exchequer named William Broome. Was he part of the family? It's hard to know. Like Auden Broome at the beginning of the 13th century, a Geoffrey Le Broome was appointed Chamberlain of the Exchequer at the end of the same century. Now, I'm briefly going to mention the Exchequer. The Exchequer was founded as a means of calculating money. So working out how people owed money and who was owed money. The Exchequer bit comes from the checkered board. And this is what you see in this image here. So they actually moved pieces around on the board and would calculate how, who owed money and how it was owed. The other way that money was calculated was through this. These are tally sticks. And again, you'd make mark on the tally sticks to say how people were, repaying you or how much they owed, and things like that. Now, I'm going to move on to Clontarf. So we've looked at Raheny briefly, we've looked at Colester briefly. So although I haven't talked about the Viking experience in Clontarf, I'm going to talk just very, very briefly about a family called the de Fipos, and their appearance in Dublin and Meath. The de Fipo family came to Ireland from Herefordshire. There's reference to a grant by Hugh de Lacy, who was one of the first almost one of the most important kind of men of Henry II who came to Ireland. And there was a grant by Hugh de Lacy to an Adam de Fipo of Screen in County Meath. Now, the Register of All Hallows, which is All Hallows was the monastery built in the 12th century on the grounds of which Trinity was later founded. This also references that Adam had a grant of Clontarf. So this de Fipo family were very well known in County Meath. And I want to kind of point out the association between Meath and Dublin. Interaction between the men of Meath and Dublin was not entirely accidental. Just the result of attendance in Dublin before the justiciars or merchants conducting business on the quayside. Hugh de Lacy was responsible for the successful colonization of Meath and the peaceful development of the newly acquired royal city of Dublin. But the responsibility had to have been shared with the men he chose to reward with land of their own. So men like Adam de Fipo. Colin Veitch, who was written extensively on Hugh de Lacy, suggests that the intention was to capitalize on Hugh's military experience in the Welsh marches. So the marches are the lands between kind of the colonized and uncolonized. And the experience of his men, the experience and the presence in Ireland of those who successfully held their lands in Meath and were clearly involved in the political and administrative life of Dublin. Hugh de Lacy was himself forced to be abroad not long after receiving his new lordship of Meath. In such circumstances, the men he left behind in Ireland had to be capable of moving freely between the political worlds of Meath and Dublin. So you see men like Adam de Fipo, he's got land in Meath, he's got land in North County Dublin. And the men in Meath had to be capable of defending that area. So people who got the lands in and around Dublin were men that were seen to be reliable and men that could be relied upon if there was an attempt by the Irish to try and reclaim their land. Now, my last little exposition today is about another neighbour, which is Rath. Now, Rath Castle was built in the 14th century by the Hollywood or de Sacrobosco family. The toponymic, a name taken from a physical place, was derived from Hollywood in North County Dublin, where the family also held lands and a church. In the late 14th century, Robert de Hollywood was part of the Irish Exchequer, originally as what's called a remembrancer, and that's someone who recorded or remembered all the Exchequer business. And he was then chief baron or judge. In 1373, he'd been granted a license to found a chantry church in Hollywood. In the 16th century, Rath briefly became the centre of political intrigue in Ireland. In the 1530s, the English crown was concerned about how powerful the Geraldine family and its head, the Earl of Kildare, Gerald Fitzgerald, had become, leading to the Earl's imprisonment in the Tower of London. His son, Silken Thomas, took over his father's duties until false word reached him that his father had been killed in the Tower. Obviously upset at this news, he burst into a Privy Council meeting being held in the chapter house of St. Mary's Abbey. He threw the sword of state on the table and declared himself in rebellion against the crown. Now, having declared himself in rebellion against the crown, he then learned that his father was actually still alive. One of Silken Thomas's actions was to seek revenge on Archbishop Allen, who was the Archbishop of Dublin and Bishop of Glendalough, who was a perceived enemy of his family. Now, the representative church body library have digitized the main documentary work left by the Archbishop. After his consecration in Christchurch Cathedral, Archbishop Allen began compiling documents for what would become known as Allen's Register. And I just show you here, this is a very old beaten up copy of it. But again, this is absolutely invaluable resource for anyone looking at, even up into the kind of early modern period in Dublin. This is a fantastic resource, and this is a copy which I managed to pick up in Oxfam, luckily enough. So the representative church body have a brilliant resource online that you can read through the register and kind of see it itself. The earliest records he accounted for reach back as far as the 12th century, and it continues up to his own administrative period in the 1530s. Now, Archbishop Allen was murdered on July 1534 as part of the Silk and Thomas rebellion. On the evening of 26th of July, the Archbishop had fled Dublin, boarded a ship at Dame Street in order to escape Silk and Thomas's rebellion. In Clontarf, the ship ran aground. He retreated to Rath, but he was betrayed and captured. Now, Silk and Thomas claimed that he had given an order for the Archbishop to be detained rather than executed. But executed he was. Now, the rebellion itself spread through Fingal, but the subsequent attempts by Silk and Thomas to take Dublin were ultimately quashed by the Crown. Now, a century later, Artane was to witness more revolution, and this is the rebellion of 1641. Now, the causes of the rebellion are very complex. Sometimes it is attributed to the plantations in Ulster in the early 17th century, kind of a slow burning retaliation for the widespread dislocation of Catholics throughout Ulster. In reality, it was a consequence of events in Ireland, England, and Scotland. And there was a breakdown in relations. Ultimately, one of the primary aims, as was nearly always the case in uprisings in Ireland, the aim of seizing Dublin Castle was one of the things that they wanted to do. The rising itself resulted in the deaths of thousands of Catholics and Protestants. On the Trinity College website, you can find evidence of a project called the Depositions. The depositions were witness statements given in the aftermath of the 1641 rebellion. They are very controversial, but if you look on the website, you find that the 1641 depositions, was a whole project done through Trinity on the depositions, and again, it brings you through kind of the social, the history of it, and that piece that I've just quoted there comes from that website. Now, Artane Castle was held as a Catholic stronghold by Luke Netterville, son of the first Viscount Netterville, a family based in County Meath since the 13th century. And he was supported by Christopher Hollywood of Artane Castle. In the depositions taken after the rebellion, Netterville was described as, and I quote, a captain of the rebels. Another deponent described 300 men in arms in the wood of Tartane belonging to Mr. Hollywood, adjoining to Clontarf. Now, a strong Catholic base in Artane was of great concern to the Crown because of its proximity to Dublin. A suggestion was made that the wood in Artane be cut down to prevent further mischief and serve for fuel comfortably. Now, in an attempt to bring administrative order to the huge change in land ownership in Ireland following Cromwell's removal of land from Catholics, new land surveys began. First, the Civil Survey, and then the Down Survey, which was taken under the direction of William Petty. Now, these two surveys, Dr. Ruth McManus is going to take up kind of the time mantle from me here in her talk, and we'll take you through the Civil Survey and the Down Survey. The last little thing that I'm going to mention today is another little kind of a travel blog, which is several centuries later than the one that I mentioned earlier. So this was from 1901. By an American gentleman called Clifton Johnson. And again, it's not something you should read if you are particularly thin-skinned, because again, quite a lot of what he has to say about the Irish isn't hugely complimentary. But this little piece, he's an extract in it about his visit to Raheny. He says, Raheny is a shapeless, straggling little hamlet, with park-like tree-dotted fields around. It has 2 inns, 2 churches, the same number of schoolhouses, and a single shabby little shop. On the day I was there, the most notable human feature of the village was a row of men near its chief inn, sitting or standing along a house wall. They were labourers waiting to be hired. It did not seem a very energetic way of finding work, but it saved shoe leather and perhaps nervous wear and tear, and it is the Irish custom. The station master said there was no middle class in the village, they had only swells and labourers. The dwellings seemed to bear out his statement, for they were either the retiring homes of gentlefolk with lawns and shrubbery about, shut away from the gaze of the street passers by high stone walls, or the barren little cottages of the peasantry. Now, hopefully I've shown you in my talk enough that can counter Clifton Johnson's not very complimentary view of Raheny. Raheny and the surrounding area was a very rural area, and it really remained quite a village up until the modern period. But it was associated, I suppose the point that I want to get across is that it was associated with the town of medieval Dublin itself, and that many of those in the town who were part of the kind of administrative class, you could call them, held lands out in the North County Dublin area around Raheny, around Colester, around Artane, around Clontarf, and were involved in the, I suppose, the protection of the area in one way from the Irish, having been given this land from the English who settled there themselves. So I hope you enjoyed my talk, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the talks in this series. Thank you.